Good evening. Good evening and welcome to this final University of Hull Maritime History seminar of the 2021-22 programme. We're obviously starting at a slightly later time this evening than we normally do. We're starting at 7 o'clock rather than 6 o'clock, so it's late for us, but it's very early for our speaker, Liz Rushen, who is speaking to us all the way from Melbourne. Isn't modern technology wonderful when it works? Liz is a research associate in the Faculty of Arts at Monash University. She's a former executive director of the Royal Historical Society of Victoria and former chair of the History Council of Victoria. She's also, take a deep breath, director of the Melbourne Maritime Heritage Network, on the editorial board of the Australian Dictionary of Biography, and last year she was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for significant service to community history and heritage preservation. And her most recent book was published in 2020, in those far off days of the early pandemic, as they seem to us now. And that was on John Marshall, a ship owner, an agent for Lloyd's Register, and also an emigration agent who was instrumental in the development of Melbourne. So very much looking forward to hearing about connections between Hull and Melbourne this evening. A couple of practicalities before we get started, though. Firstly, I should have reminded you right at the very outset, and I'm doing so now, that this session is being recorded. Secondly, questions. As those who've been to one of these online seminars before will know, there are a couple of ways you can ask a question. You can either pop it directly into the questions box, which you should have on the right-hand side of your screen, or if you just raise a hand, I'll keep the attendees list open, and that way, if you just raise a hand, I will notice that you want to ask a question, and we'll unmute your microphone and invite you to ask your question at the appropriate time. So I think that's all the practicalities over and done with. Welcome once again, and a thank you in advance to our speaker for getting up so horribly early to speak to us, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Martin, and good evening, everyone. Although it is somewhat early here, when I agreed to do this talk, we in Melbourne were on daylight saving and you hadn't started summertime yet. But of course, with the clock changes, it makes it quite early here. So I hope this webinar will go smoothly. Thank you for coming along tonight to hear about John Marshall and his connections to Melbourne, John Marshall of Hull. So he had deep links to both Hull and Melbourne, and John Marshall's shipping activity illustrates the connection between the two cities. In the early 19th century, Marshall amassed a fleet of 30 ships, which traded in the West Indies and Baltic ports, fished in the Davis Straits and the Southern Fishery, before turning towards Australasia and the Far East. The development of his ship owning illustrates how a self-made man in the 19th century could accrue great wealth by reading the markets and turning risks into opportunities. Responsible for the reform of ship classification and Lloyd's Register of Shipping in the 1830s, the following decade, Marshall became Britain's busiest immigration agent. Known in London as Mr. Marshall of Hull, this talk demonstrates his role in the settlement of Melbourne. This tinted lithograph is one of the earliest representations of Melbourne. It shows Marshall's Emigration Office as one of the 20 most significant buildings in the first years of the settlement. Just get rid of that little, that's better. So who was John Marshall and what was his connection to Hull? But first, a note of clarification. John Marshall, the subject of this paper, is not to be confused with John Marshall of Scullcoats and Hornsey, who died in 1825 and who also owned a considerable fleet of ships in the same period. His ships included the Andrew Marvell, Brothers, Comet, North Britain, Samuel Spivey and Sisters. The John Marshall I'm talking about was born at Ferrybridge in the West Riding of Yorkshire one spring morning in 1787. By the time he was 10, the family had moved back to his father's ancestral township of Bentley with Arksey near Doncaster. In 1810, when he was aged 23, John Marshall had established himself in London as a shipbroker, eventually establishing his office at 26 Birchin Lane, Cornhill. But throughout his life, he had a close association with Hull. It was in the huge 700-year-old Church of Holy Trinity, which dominates Hull's Old Town, that John Marshall married Betsy Featherstone on the 20th of March, 1810. The daughter of James and Elizabeth Featherstone, Betsy was born and raised on North Churchside. Her Hull-born father started as a lighterman and soon progressed to owning ships of his own, small at first, but gradually increasing his fleet. At the time of Betsy's birth, James Featherstone conducted his shipping interests from his property at Featherstone's Entry, 178 High Street, conveniently backing onto the River Hull. By 1806, he owned a substantial fleet of ships, primarily engaged in the Caribbean and Baltic trades. It's possible that Marshall had learned the shipping business from his father-in-law, their later business ventures indicating a close connection between the two. All but one of Betsy's 4 brothers were also involved in the shipping trade. When aged 35 and captain of their father's ship Elizabeth, Betsy's eldest brother James died at Stangate Creek, a short-lived British settlement on the west coast of Africa. Her 3rd brother, Thomas, died at sea at 1817, aged 34, on his way home to Hull from a trading voyage to Jamaica. Betsy was close to her next brother, Francis William, a surgeon who dabbled in the Russian trade and was the only one to survive the family's involvement in shipping. When their father died in 1822, John Featherstone, the eldest surviving son, inherited the family shipping business and his father's house, Southwood Villa at Cottingham. As late as October 1828, Marshall advertised for cargo for John Featherstone's fine new ship, the Hull-built 361-ton Lord Godric, which was lying for inspection in the West India Docks in London. When Featherstone was forced into bankruptcy in 1830, John Marshall purchased several of his ships. Broking required little financial capital. It was the broker's connections which were important and often resulted in lucrative commissions. By ploughing back the profits, they had sufficient resources to finance the purchase of old, cheap ships, and this is exactly what Marshall did. Within 8 years of his move to the capital and establishing himself as a broker, together with his brother Thomas, he was owner of the 314-ton ship Faith, which his father-in-law, James Featherstone, had owned since it was built in 1810. Before long, the brothers also co-owned the 176-ton Elizabeth with James Featherstone. Both the Faith and Elizabeth were registered in Hull and were the only ships in John Marshall's extensive fleet to be registered at that port. 4 years after John married Betsy Featherstone at Hull's Holy Trinity, his brother, Thomas Mulcaster Marshall, married Sarah Foster at the same church. Sally, as she was known, was the daughter and granddaughter of Hull shipowners, both named Joel Foster. Sally was also raised on Churchside alongside Holy Trinity, where today can be seen a marble memorial to her father, an elder brother and one of the wardens of Hull's Trinity House. Among Joel Foster's ships were the favourite Isabella, Lord Wellington, Neptune and Talia. Around the time of his daughter's marriage, Joel Foster's ships were trading in ports as varied as Russia and the Netherlands, the West Indies, east coast of America and Canada, and the Mediterranean. His ledger account reveals that he began insuring his ships with the Marshall brothers as early as 1810, even though Thomas wouldn't become his son-in-law for another 4 years. In 1814, Foster insured the Lord Wellington's voyage to Montenegro with the brothers for nearly £329. Similarly, in 1817, he insured the Talia's voyage to Jamaica with the Marshall brothers, and by lesser amounts to 5 others, including G&T Earl, also his sons-in-law. 2 of Sally's sisters, Mary Ann and Anne, married George and Thomas Earl of the major Hull employee G&T Earl cement makers. It was Anne and Thomas's sons, Charles and William, who founded the major Hull shipbuilding firm of C&W Earl. When John Marshall appeared before the 1836 parliamentary inquiry into shipwrecks, he revealed that he had been a ship owner and foreign shipping agent for more than 30 years. Close examination of the shipping registers at the National Archives indicates that between 1814 and 1838, he owned or part-owned at least 30 ships, totalling over 8,000 tonnes, ranging in size from the 146-tonne Venus to the 436-tonne Maria. A study of the structure of his trade and the repeated use of his favoured captains tells us much about the man and the strategies he used to seek new markets and obtain profitable cargoes. For Britain's powerful financial and mercantile interests, the loss of markets experienced during the long years of war was compensated by the opening up of new markets. The ambitious young ship and insurance broker from Yorkshire was beginning to contribute to the informal empire of influence, the tip of the empirical iceberg of colonial control, which was the outstanding feature of Britain's expansion overseas after 1815. Marshall's first foray into ship ownership was his purchase on the 1st of March 1814 of a 1/3 share in a square-sterned ship of 379 tonnes, the Loyalty, newly built at Hull. The Loyalty's first voyage was to the Caribbean island of Martinique, on the cusp of the island's return to French control. Marshall supported the shipbuilding industry in the city he regarded as home, purchasing at least 5 Hull-built ships, but none appear to have been built by G&W Earl, the Hull shipbuilders who were part of the wider Marshall familial network. After purchasing the Loyalty, John Marshall acquired the first of 7 ships which he either bought from, sold to, or owned with his wife's family, the Featherstones. On the 29th of April 1815, John and Thomas Marshall, the two partners, purchased the Elizabeth from James and John Featherstone and their partners, selling it 2 days later. In March 1817, the Marshall brothers purchased the first ship which they wholly owned, the Anne, a 288-tonne square-sterned ship built in 1805 at Thorn on the River Don, located only 8 miles from the Marshall home in Arksey. It was not an auspicious start to ship owning, as a month after their purchase, the Anne ran aground at Gravesend. However, it was only a temporary inconvenience, as John and Thomas received permission from the West India Dock Company on the 1st of April to make alterations to the ship in the export dock. In 1818, the year John was accepted into the Wheelwrights Company before he obtained his freedom of the City of London, the Marshall brothers purchased 2 ships, the Angustine and 2 months later, the Faith. John and Thomas knew the Angustine well, having chartered the ship and imported a cargo of rum in December 1816. The brothers jointly owned the Angustine until June 1821, when their partnership ceased and John bought out Thomas's share. 4 years later, John sold the ship to his brother-in-law, John Featherstone. The Angustine was built at Grimsby in 1815 and named for John Julius Angustine. Known as the father of Lloyds, Angustine was a well-connected banker and influential underwriter who was chair of Lloyds for 10 years from 1796. He was also a great art lover, putting together an outstanding collection, which eventually became the nucleus of the National Gallery collection in London. John Marshall took nearly a decade to fully own the 314-tonne Faith, which was built in 1810 on the River Ouse at Selby, just 10 miles from his birthplace. Its first owners were James and John Featherstone, together with Thomas Clark Collings, and anchor smiths Benjamin and Thomas Pullen, all from Hull. For the Faith's maiden voyage to Rio de Janeiro in January 1811, Betsy's brother Thomas was captain. In early 1812, Betsy's oldest brother James captained the Faith on its voyage to Rio and to Malta in 1813. This was the first of two ships of that name which John Marshall owned, as in March 1825 he purchased the newly built 257-ton Faith as sole owner. This Faith made its maiden voyage from the shipyard at West Cowes, Isle of Wight, in December that year, sailing to New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, calling into Madeira under Captain William Deloitte. Arriving in Sydney in August 1826 with a general cargo, the ship was destined to return to London and Hull via Batavia, but the ever-watchful Captain Deloitte saw another opportunity, and the ship made a quick foray to New Zealand to load timber spars and masts for the colonial market, selling the cargo in Sydney. Born in Hull in 1796, William Deloitte was the son of Count Deloitte, Treasurer and Private Secretary to King Louis XVI of France. Deloitte lost all his estates during Robespierre's reign of terror in 1793 and fled to England. Captain Deloitte's maternal uncle was a wealthy Hamburg merchant, and while his brother chose the business world and founded the international accounting firm Deloitte's, William Salmon Deloitte chose the sea. When he was aged 22, he earned a gold cup for undertaking 12 voyages each way between Hull and Hamburg in 1 year. After 20 years as the master of various ships, including Marshall's Anne and Faith, 2 trips to New Zealand and a whaling voyage, in 1838, Deloitte settled in the colony as a merchant and ship owner, trading as W.S. Deloitte and Company. Deloitte became the director of many public companies. He was a Justice of the Peace for the City of Sydney, a water police magistrate, and has a fine plaque in his memory in the sandstone-built Garrison Church in the Rocks, Sydney. Marshall's purchase of the newly built Blackwall Carvel Doncaster in February 1825 marked the beginning of his sole ownership of his remaining fleet of 14 ships, with the exception of the Maria and Jessie Lawson, most of which plied to and from Australia, taking passengers and general cargo out, returning via Java, India or China, with timber, wool, whale oil and sealskins for the British market. From these early accounts of his ship owning, it is evident that John Marshall was an astute judge of markets, mixing up his ownership to spread the risk and dealing with various colonial agency houses according to their capabilities. There was a prolonged shipping depression in the mid-1820s, and its effects can be seen in Marshall's sale of 10 of his ships in the 2 years 1824 to 26, including the Anne, which he had owned for 9 years. In 1827 to 29, he sold 5 ships, and in 1830 to 31, he had another spurt of divesting himself of ships, selling 9 in these 2 years. Marshall sold 5 of these ships within 7 months of purchase, indicating he was deeply committed to speculation as well as trade: the Kingston, Ulster, Hotspur, Lloyds and Tranby. Built in 1823 at Hull, the Tranby was the oldest of this group of ships. Initially used in the Russian trade, early in 1828 the Tranby had broken anchor and was swept 2 miles down the Humber River before being flung on its side on a sandbank. The ship was purchased by Bolton and Humphrey, ship owners and shipbrokers of Hull, and was thoroughly repaired before being chartered by Locking and Wakes as the first ship to take emigrants to the Swan River settlement or Perth in Western Australia. The 37 intrepid passengers and 14 crew, together with livestock and farming equipment, were crowded into the small ship as it made its way south under the command of Captain John Story. It was purchased by Marshall in 1831 on its return from Perth. Both the Kingston and Ulster were coastal traders, mainly moving goods between London, Hull and Newcastle. Marshall purchased both these ships from his brother-in-law John Featherstone to forestall the latter's bankruptcy. Built in Hull in 1828, Marshall purchased the Kingston in May 1829, 6 months after it was first registered, selling all 64 shares back to John Featherstone 1 month later. Similarly, in October 1830, Marshall purchased the Ulster, built at Sutton, Yorkshire in 1817, and sold it back to John Featherstone 4 months later. The Lloyds and Hotspur were both newly built in Hull. Marshall commissioned the building of the Lloyds from Samuel S. Walton, whose company eventually evolved into the Dry Pool Engineering and Dry Dock Company. Marshall owned the Lloyds for only 3 months, selling it in July 1830. The Hotspur was built in 1829 by Bolton and Humphrey of Church Street, Sculcoats. The ship departed Gravesend in May that year for its maiden voyage, arriving in Sydney on the 1st of November, 6 months before Marshall purchased it. During the voyage, James Gardner, a passenger, kept a delightfully illustrated journal, which provides a particularly lively account of the crossing of the line ceremony, an event undertaken by sailors and feared by many passengers. And then there was the Harmony, the ship owned by Marshall for the longest time. This 373-ton whaler was different to all the other ships owned by Marshall. Built in 1816 at New Brunswick, Canada, of black birch timber, the Harmony was solely owned by Marshall for 11 years until February 1838. It was one of only 2 Marshall-owned ships to carry convicts to the Australian colonies. After carrying 80 female convicts to Sydney in 1827, Harmony then sailed for the Bay of Islands, New Zealand, where in 14 days it loaded, according to the Sydney Gazette, one of the most valuable cargoes ever procured from New Zealand, the finest spars in the world. Returning to London, it was the first ship to land New Zealand timber there. Whalers usually had an E1 rating at Lloyd's, but the Harmony was first class, rated A1. The ship had left England in August 1830 with a crew of 33, first sailing to the Timor Strait, Guam, and then the Solomon Islands. By December 1831, there was a mutiny and the ship limped into Sydney, where the case caused a sensation. 20 of the crew were charged with mutiny, which carried a death penalty. Those found guilty, including the first and third mates, were taken to the Phoenix Hull, but 3 months later they were discharged. With a change of crew, the Harmony resumed whaling in the South Seas fishery, eventually sailing to London in October 1834 with 800 barrels of oil. In nearly 20 years of ship owning, Marshall had done much to promote the Australian colonies and had gained financially from exporting passengers and goods and importing Australian commodities. He had spread his risk between the world's markets and his careful adjustments of the percentages of the ships he owned by his partnerships with family members and his favoured captains, and by chartering the government and the powerful East India Company. To Marshall, Australia provided one great market, and he could rely on freight and passengers to keep the ships he was chartering, as well as his own ships, optimally employed. This was a seamless business strategy, combining shipping, import and wholesale merchant activities with the passenger trade. Prior to the discovery of gold in 1851, emigration to Australia, voluntary or not, was the prime cargo on the voyage to the colonies. But the real profit for merchants and their agents was in backfilling the ships with colonial produce and goods like raw cotton from Bombay, coffee from Ceylon, sugar from Bengal, rice from Burmese ports, Chinese tea, and sugar from Mauritius, Manila, and Java. Although Marshall's business interests were expanding, he didn't actively participate in political life or take on positions of responsibility in the many philanthropic and business-related organisations established in London in the early 19th century. He did, however, take an active role in the masterful reorganisation of Lloyd's registry, a change which still affects shipping today. Together with his brother Thomas, John Marshall made his first appearance in Lloyd's Red Register in 1820 as a ship owner, and the following year, both John and Thomas are listed as subscribers. By this time, John was actively involved in the Merchants and Shipowner Society, now the London Shipowners and River Users Association, and it was through this platform that he pushed for reform of the system of dual registers. At that time, Lloyds ran two registers on the classification of ships, the red for ship owners and the green for underwriters, and it was forbidden to share information in the books. As a major London ship owner, John Marshall saw that too many lives and cargoes were being lost through misinformation provided in the separate registers, and he successfully argued for their fusion. It took nearly a decade for Marshall's reforms to be put in place, resulting in a combined register which is still used and published today as Lloyd's Register of Shipping. Marshall also argued for an overhaul of the system of ship classification based on age, condition and the quality of construction, greater control over surveyors, and a reform committee with representation beyond ship owners and underwriters. We all know the phrase A1 for top quality. That term was devised by Marshall's Committee of Inquiry to describe the condition of a ship for insurance purposes, where the letters refer to the ship's hull and the numerals to the equipment. Prior to Marshall's reforms, a single surveyor was employed by Lloyd's Register, but when the revised register was first published in 1834, 63 surveyors were listed and the ports to which they were appointed. John Marshall represented the outport of Hull, and this has led to confusion over the years, as sometimes he's referred to as a ship owner of London and at other times of Hull. While he had strong Hull connections, by this stage he was a major ship owner of London. In 1823, a society of ship owners had been formed at Hull, and during the progress of the Marshall's inquiry's work, Marshall had kept his Hull colleagues updated with its proceedings. Due to his prominent role, in 1833, Marshall was offered a position on the managing committee of Lloyd's Register, but he declined in favour of his increasing business interests with Australia. That year, the British government had entered into an arrangement with a committee of philanthropists from a charitable institution in London to administer the mass emigration of single women and girls to address the gender imbalance in the colonies. When Marshall presented his credentials with the aim of being the committee's agent, the committee was impressed with Marshall's expertise and references, which included one from Lieutenant Richard Halyard, a Royal Navy lieutenant from Hull. The London Immigration Committee subsequently enabled nearly 3,000 women, accompanied by nearly 1,400 family members, to migrate to New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, on 14 ships in the year 1833 to 1837, which was the subject of my doctoral thesis, later published as Single and Free. Clearly, there were business advantages for Marshall in conveying the women to Australia and backloading the ships with goods from Australasia, the Pacific and Asia. Marshall implied that his motivations to become involved in female emigration was due to his concern about the want of female society there. It was a view widely shared in Britain and was certainly also one of the motivations of the London Immigration Committee members, who were linked by their common religious, mercantile, scientific and philanthropic interests, people such as Samuel Hoare, Charles Lushington, Edward Forster and Sir Edward Parry. Where Marshall shone was in the transport of passengers and freight, using his expertise in shipbroking gained in the previous 20 years. He built up considerable experience in mobilising and conveying emigrants, but from the time he became involved in female migration, he faced constant attacks on his character and business dealings. Following the death of his namesake son John in 1836 and the cessation of the London Immigration Committee the same year, Marshall threw himself into the family immigration business. The convergence of two government decisions allowed family immigration to take off. The 1831 decision to fund immigration from the sales of Crown land in the colonies, they are the Ripon regulations, and the new Poor Law clauses, which came into force in 1835, which provided the machinery for parish immigration. This is where John Marshall would concentrate his efforts for 5 years, becoming the best known and major immigration agent in the Australian trade. It was to prove a poor business decision and one which caused him to lose his social standing and his fortune. While Marshall was actively involved with female immigration, he developed a bounty system for family migration. Under this system, migrants were introduced into the colonies by private individuals, either in the colonies or in Britain. Colonists who required labour identified the categories of workers which they both needed and purchased bounty orders for them. Government and private agents in Britain, most usually colonial surgeons, would select appropriate immigrants and arrange their passage. On arrival, they were examined by an immigration board, and if found satisfactory, the migrants were assured of a job from the nominating colonists, and the agent was paid a bounty to cover the voyage for approved migrants. At the same time, the government devised a slightly different system. Government officers selected immigrants and transported them on government chartered ships, and the colonial governments provided initial short-term support for the migrants on their arrival in the colonies. The colonists argued that the first system was cheaper and brought more suitable immigrants, but the government authorities complained that the bounty agents often deceived the migrants and didn't make proper arrangements for their supervision and accommodation on board ship. In fact, the regulations governing the recruitment of both bounty and government immigrants were so similar that there was very little difference regarding the mechanics of application, the conditions on board ship, or the quality of the immigrants. However, one important difference between the government and bounty ships was that government ships excluded capitalists, whereas the bounty ships were permitted to include these men of means. When the trade was at its peak, each month John Marshall advertised the departure of an immigrant ship to various parts of the expanding British Empire, and he ran constant advertisements in the major and local newspapers for passengers and freight. During his years of experience in chartering ships for the immigration of single women, John Marshall provided well-fitted-out ships. His ships had very few deaths due to the attention to the cleanliness of the ship, the provision of medical comforts, and his insistence that the published victualling scheme was adhered to during the voyage. He constantly sought to improve the experience of his passengers, introducing an expensive and highly successful patent footing apparatus, or a stove, for the convenience of passengers, which the government later installed on their ships. Marshall's good standing in immigration ensured that the new governors of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land travelled to their postings via his ships. Sir John Franklin on the Fairlie in August 1836, and Sir George Gipps on the Upton Castle in May 1838, the fourth of Marshall's ships to depart Plymouth that year. Also on board the Upton Castle was the cultured priest James Gould, later to become Archbishop of Melbourne. Realising that immigrants needed a safe place to stay while waiting to board their ships, in 1835 Marshall leased a substantial disused facility on Plymouth's Baltic Wharf to build Britain's first immigration depot, creating a template for the government's later depots at Deptford in London and Birkenhead, Liverpool. Hundreds of thousands of migrants from England, Wales and Ireland stayed at Marshall's depot at Plymouth before embarking on the long voyage to Australia. In the depot, meals, laundry and bathing facilities and reading matter were provided, while the immigrants prepared their outfits and goods for the voyage. They were divided into male, female and family accommodation, much like on ship. In this way, Marshall was able to offer a complete immigration package. At the end of the 1830s, the recently settled district of Port Phillip was desperately short of labour, and assisted immigration was extended to the new settlement. The first ship to sail direct from Britain with settlers was the David Clark, which arrived on the 27th of October 1839 from Greenock, Scotland. In the ensuing 2 months, a further 3 vessels, the William Metcalfe, Westminster and John Bull, arrived carrying nearly 650 immigrants assisted by John Marshall. Of the first 17 migrant ships to Melbourne, Marshall had bounty immigrants on 9 of them, all his ships commencing their voyage at London before calling into Plymouth to collect additional passengers who were staying at his emigration depot. The excitement in Port Phillip at the arrival of the immigrant ships is reflected in a newspaper report. Long has the province been distressed for the want of adequate labour. The cheerful prospect which is now open to us through the exertions of Mr. Marshall and his agents will give a fresh impulse to the exertions of the settlers in the culture of corn and wool. In Melbourne, Marshall's passengers were met by his agents, partners George Thomas, his former London clerk, who Marshall had sent to Melbourne on the ship the William Metcalfe, John Enscoe and George James, who had also worked for Marshall in London. But we can see in this slide the beginnings of a major deception. In the local directory, the 3 partners claimed that Marshall was their London agent. In fact, they were Marshall's agents, as were all the companies they declared were agents of the firm. Interestingly, they weren't quite sure who were Marshall's agents in Mauritius, Singapore, Rio, or New Zealand. This is how Marshall organised his business. He developed a well-oiled procedure for sending out immigrants. He built up a network of agents in Britain and the colonies. His agents in the southwest of England included J.P. Wilcox, a solicitor of Plymouth, and his men spread throughout the southern counties, as shown on this slide. To receive the immigrants in the colonies, Marshall used several local agents. His main agent in Sydney was the firm of William and Thomas Walker. He also used 2 of his ship's captains who settled in Sydney, John Forster Church and William Salmon Deloitte. In Melbourne, he had trusted 2 of his former agents, and he also used his brother. In 1840, Marshall assisted his brother, Thomas Mulcaster Marshall, to migrate to Melbourne as his agent. Thomas wasted no time in becoming involved in community affairs, but when he was named in the first libel case in Victoria and also became a casualty of bankruptcy, Thomas left Melbourne and purchased the site of the now heritage-listed Sunnyside Wool Scour at Breakwater on the Barwon River near Geelong. He also moved his family to Woodstock House, which was on 66 prime acres going down to the Barwon River, and in 1850 he stood for the local council but was unsuccessful. The fast-growing suburb of Marshall in Greater Geelong is named for his family, and a community group in Marshall is currently fighting to save one of only 2 original bluestone cottages in the Greater Geelong area. Meanwhile, Thomas Marshall was going from strength to strength, but his success rankled with Thomas Frederick Elliott, the head of the Colonial Land and Immigration Commission. The appointment of this commission in 1840 provided the British government with a way of managing the colonies through migration in an environment where the colonies were straining against imperial control. And the pawn in this policy, as far as emigration was concerned, was John Marshall. But it was not only the government's policies which brought down his business interests, he had a hand in it as well, through overinvestment in the colonies. The explosive colonisation and optimism of the 1830s had encouraged many merchants to invest widely in livestock, property and joint stock companies. By the early 1840s, these investments were failing. Many merchants and farmers couldn't pay their debts and were buying on credit. London bounty agents like Marshall were being squeezed. He'd been riding a wave, but it was all about to come tumbling down in dramatic style. Unfortunately for Marshall, during 1841, He had organised a dozen ships to sail to the Port Phillip district, and in an attempt to realise his assets in Australia, he sent his 17-year-old son Frederick to Sydney to sort out his affairs. By his own admission, Marshall had invested too heavily in the Australian trade, but he had also been let down by his former clerks, who had made unwise business decisions and had been somewhat duplicitous in their business dealings with their principal in London. An example of their deceit can be seen in the purchase and subsequent mortgage of 5 Marshall-owned properties in central Melbourne, including 3 blocks purchased by John Enscoe and George James in 1840, spending over £1,100, shown here by the blue stars. They sold these 3 blocks to J.H. Walsh, whose widow inherited the properties, but she became insolvent in 1843. By this time, Marshall's hold on his properties had been lost. Marshall had sent too many goods on consignment and had warehouses filled with items which were impossible to move. But he wasn't the only one. His shipping colleagues involved in bounty emigration, like his old friend and soon-to-be Lord Mayor of London, John Pirrie, also Duncan Dunbar, Robert Brooks, John Gore and Thomas Ward, were all impacted by the Australian recession, but had lucky escapes. Marshall wasn't so lucky, and by July 1841, he was unable to meet his creditors' demands and penned a letter of withdrawal from bounty emigration, although he still had several ships on their way to Australia. His was one of the most spectacular crashes resulting from the crisis. In January 1842, Marshall passed through the London Court of Bankruptcy with debts estimated to be over £111,000 or £12 million today. When his certificate of bankruptcy was issued, Commissioner Williams praised Marshall's honour, integrity and humanity, writing that this disaster, which wrecked the prosperity of Australia, also wrecked this respectable and meritorious man. Marshall's failure became big news. The Sydney Herald editorialised that Marshall appeared to have been influenced not by a sordid desire for gain, but by a wish to do good, and he ought to be looked upon as a benefactor to the colony. The Port Phillip Gazette lauded Marshall for performing a gigantic part in the early advancement of this colony, while the Port Phillip Patriot stated, "To Mr. Marshall, Port Phillip stands indebted to much of that prosperity which has placed us so far in advance of any of the other Australian colonies." While subject to the Bankruptcy Court and suffering from the effects of his shattering business reversal, Marshall relocated his family from his impressive home, one of the 5 houses of Hackney, to Southampton to pick up the pieces of his emigration business. The problem was that he was no longer a young man. In April 42, he turned 55. From this base, he made a remarkable comeback into assisted migration before things turned sour again. Marshall added an extra string to his bow by joining the established emigration trade to Canada, and he continued to improve and streamline the process of migration. He saw that a significant improvement in embarkation could be achieved by utilising the new railways so that passengers could be embarked on the same day they left their homes. As the South Western Railway terminated at Southampton, terminus was at Southampton at the docks, transfer of passengers and their luggage to the ships was a simple process. For Marshall, it was also straightforward and inexpensive to send freight by train at Vauxhall to Southampton, thus avoiding lighterage at the London docks. Marshall's rehabilitation in the eyes of the Colonial Land and Immigration Commissioners was complete when in 1846 he won the tender to convey emigrants to South Australia. News had begun filtering through to Britain of large copper deposits in South Australia, and Marshall was able to secure a government contract to supply labour. The new system worked well. The sailing season for Canada was March to July, for Adelaide June to August, to the Cape of Good Hope October, November and January. And of course, he could fill the ships with freight on the return trip. From Canada, the major cargo was timber. From Australia, it was wool, while ships to the Cape could travel to India and the Far East for fabrics and spices. Marshall became the general manager of the newly formed Southampton Immigration and Shipping Company, but his involvement in emigration was limited, and he turned his focus to a new venture, coal. In Reading, Berkshire, he formed the Great Western Coal Company and built up another business empire with over 40 outlets supplying much sought-after coal throughout the south of England, before that venture too went belly up through poor financial advice and the avarice of his chief clerk. One of the major disappointments in Marshall's life was that none of his 4 sons followed him into the business, and none of his 3 daughters married. At a time when commercial empires were built on a network of relationships, Marshall had to rely on employees rather than family members, and many people let him down. It was particularly tragic that none of Marshall's sons assisted him during his final decade of decline, when he needed them most. None achieved any success in the business world, although Frederick made his mark in Paris during the 1871 siege and through his work with the Japanese legation there for 17 years. He has been credited as primarily instrumental in establishing effective Japanese diplomatic agencies in Europe. Marshall's 3 surviving sons all became authors. The eldest, Thomas, an Anglican priest who, like his brothers, converted to Catholicism during Newman's heyday, wrote several papers critical of Anglican missions and was awarded an honorary doctorate by Georgetown's Jesuit University. Marshall's youngest daughter, Jane, was forced to support herself through teaching, and she ran a small school at Reading for nearly 20 years. Marshall was immensely proud of his children, and while only 2 sons married, none of his 3 adult grandchildren had children, and there are no descendants to promote his work. With some words taken from Iago's speech in Othello, John Marshall summed up his situation in the final year of his life. He was unwell, drowning in his memories of his wealthier earlier years, and now he was struggling to retain all he had left, his good name. In typical style, he embellished Shakespeare's words by the use of italics and block capitals for his own emphasis. Good name in man and woman is the immediate jewel of their souls. Who steals my purse steals trash. 'Tis something, nothing, 'twas mine, 'tis his, and has been slave to thousands. But he that filches from me my good name robs me of that which not enriches him, and makes me poor indeed. Marshall was a man of principle who valued his good name. As he stated in one of his pamphlets, I am anxious above all things to bequeath a good name. By the time of his death, he had lost even that. With 3 bankruptcies behind him, a 21st century business person would see Marshall as unsuccessful. But in the 19th century, many entrepreneurs tried and failed. Temporary or permanent financial failure was a common feature of trade, industry and banking, affecting thousands of businesses. In his lifetime, Marshall was acknowledged as performing a great service to New South Wales and the Port Phillip district through the increase in labour his tens of thousands of migrants brought to the developing colonies. But recognition of his contribution in this arena has been tarnished by the lingering criticisms of his detractors, government officials who wanted to control migration, and colonists who welcomed immigration but wanted to control who arrived in the colonies. Even Marshall's contribution to providing safe lodging at Plymouth for emigrants prior to embarkation has been erased, and his contribution to ship classification through his work with Lloyd's Register has been forgotten. Marshall died in poverty, but there is room in history to celebrate the lives of people who have made a significant contribution to society, although their personal circumstances condemn them to financial hardship. The events of Marshall's later life have diminished recognition of his achievements for over 150 years, and he has slipped between the pages of remembrance. But his contributions to safe shipping, the development of trade between Australia and Britain, and the establishment of systems which ensured the safe passage of hundreds of thousands of migrants to Australia and beyond, deserve greater recognition. You can read more about my work on early 19th century migration in my books or on my website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was fascinating. Thoroughly enjoyed that. We have one question in the questions box, which I'm assuming, because it's been typed in, the asker would like me to ask on his behalf. Put a hand up quickly if I'm wrong about that. Nope. Well, this question from Paul Hughes says, Marshall's activity coincided with Samuel Plimsoll's, though earlier by about 20 years. At less than 500 tonnes what Freeboard had his ships, what cargoes his primary interest did Marshall lose due to his secondary interest, ships foundering? A couple of questions in there for you, Liz.
Yes, there are, aren't there? I don't know that he lost cargoes. Only 2 of his ships were shipwrecked, or the first one actually wasn't totally wrecked. It was a Jessie Lawson, and it was caught in a storm in Plymouth Harbour and ran into 2 other ships, so it was damaged but not totally wrecked. Another ship, and I've forgotten exactly which one it was, did go down in Java, hit a reef in Java, but it had already disembarked its passengers in Sydney, and it was on its way home. And I don't think by reaching Java would have been the first port of call after Sydney. So I don't think he actually lost cargo through that.
He was fortunate in that respect, if not in some others.
Yeah.
Stefan, I can see you've got a hand up. The floor is... Oh. I'm trying to unmute you and the system doesn't seem to want to. Stefan, could you try unmuting your own microphone, please?
Is it working now? Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you loud and clear.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thanks, Liz. Thank you very much for getting up so early to talk to us. It's been really, really interesting. I really enjoyed that. I've got a couple of tangential questions in a way. You know, the kind of moral aspect of this. He seems to be a very, very moral man. Was there a religious kind of underpinning to that? Because Methodism was very big in Hull at that time, and I wondered whether that kind of informed his kind of approach. So that's one question. And the second question, again tangential, but how did they attract women to migrate to kind of New South Wales? What was the kind of lure? How was that kind of marketed? Yeah, so two questions there.
Okay, so the first one on Marshall's religious beliefs. I suspect they were evangelicals. I suspect his family were evangelicals. Although when he was living in Hackney, I know he rented a pew at St John's Hackney, hence his son's beautiful tomb in Hackney, the churchyard of St John's Hackney. And interestingly, John Marshall Jr.'s tomb is between, on one side, he's got Sir Francis Beaufort. On the other side, he's got Sir John Hunter, who was Governor of New South Wales. So, I mean, the connections were enormous. And I think Marshall's involvement at St John's certainly helped him in a business sense. And I think one of Marshall's mentors was Thomas Wilson, an MP, and he was also at St John's. So St John's in those days was huge, and I think it worked for Marshall. But I actually find it quite interesting that all 3 surviving sons turned to Catholicism. I think that must be pretty unusual to have had. I mean, St John's was fairly high Anglican, but for all of them to converted, and then one of them wrote really quite disparaging pieces about Anglican missionaries, and then as I read out, he was awarded a doctorate by by Georgetown University, which is a very Catholic university in the States. And then another son wrote quite satirical pieces, a bit nasty really about Anglicans. So Something was going on in the religious background of the Marshall family, but apart from that evidence, you know, and without letters or things, it's really hard to draw any more conclusions. As to your second question about what would have attracted a single woman to migrate to what was equivalent to the moon in the 1830s, I think a lot of them wanted opportunity, basically. The colonies gave people a lot of freedom, whether they're family migrants or single people. They were able to get out of villages that perhaps had been a bit unfriendly to them or their families. It was the opportunity for a new start. You know, there are lots of reasons, and I argue in my work that people migrate because they can see greater opportunities in the place they're going to. It's, you know, the old question of push-pull factors. I think there are both are in play, and those women migrated for exactly the same sorts of reasons as people migrate today. They're looking for more opportunities. They're looking for freedom. They're taking, you know, going for adventure, some of them. It's less easy for us to understand why illiterate girls would migrate. But I think, you know, John Marshall, I showed one of those posters for one of the female immigrant ships. Those posters, they're huge, you know, 3 feet in the old money by 2 feet. They're enormous posters. They were put in shops around towns. Priests and ministers used to talk about the emigration from the pulpit. Novelists used to write about it. Austen talked about, I've forgotten which book it was, but, you know, there were lots of women sewing in villages, and one man comes into the village and, you know, it's a great opportunity for them perhaps. But as was immigration, and she actually talked about immigration being an opportunity for girls whose opportunities were diminishing at home. So again, the women who were literate and made an informed decision to migrate, you can argue that they were actually braver. You know, they were really the girls who wanted to move on rather than stay in the safety and security of home.
Great, thank you, Liz. Yeah, it sort of sounds incredible today, doesn't it, that you'd be able to, you know, have the bravery to do that when all you knew maybe was a small village. And yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Especially the danger and discomfort of the voyage as well.
Yeah.
I don't think I could have travelled as steerage in one of those ships.
No.
It would be horrible.
But it's a great story you've uncovered there, Liz, and you know, the connection between Hull and Melbourne that we've been talking about quite a lot is very, very strong, isn't it, through John Marshall, I think.
It is through Marshall, definitely. Well, that illustration for his depot to have been one of, you know, 20 significant places where Melbourne was first established, I mean, that's pretty telling.
Yeah.
And it's the site, I didn't read up, but the site of his immigration depot in Melbourne became the site of the Customs House, which is now the site of our Immigration Museum.
Right. Yeah. It's another really strong connection. I mean, is he well known in Melbourne? I mean,
no,
you know,
no one knows about Marshall. No.
Right.
People are becoming a little bit more aware of the name Marshall in Geelong because of the work to retain a bluestone cottage. It's only one of 2 in the greater Geelong area. But it's in the town of Marshall, which was named for the family. It wasn't actually the Marshall cottage, but, you know, in Australia, progress, a lot of road widening is going on, and so the Country Roads Board wanted to just demolish the cottage, and the residents have said, no, we want to retain that cottage. So it's quite an interesting work on behalf of the community to try and save the cottage.
Great, thank you, Liz, and thanks again for getting up so early. It's really
that's all right. Well, I'm battling a cold as well. We didn't mention that earlier, so hence my couple of coughs during it.
They were barely noticeable. Do we have any further questions? I can't see any hands up, but here's your opportunity, because if not, I'm afraid, threat rather than promise, I've got one. Question from John Hoyle. Would you like to unmute yourself? Yep, you're unmuted. So yep, can hear you loud and clear.
Liz, I've really enjoyed that. I went to school at not far from Hull, a place called Poppington, which is where William Wilberforce went to school. And of course, he was living at about the time of John Marshall, but more particularly his parents were operating in the area. Is there any evidence that you've gone through the bounty emigration to Australia? Is there any evidence that Wilberforce was canvassed at all by the Marshall family in terms of were they involved in any transportation following the abolition of slavery at all? For instance, in other words, bringing people back from an offensive lifestyle?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Wilberforce, and the connections. I haven't been able to find definite connections between Wilberforce and Marshall. Of course, the Featherstone entry is just down the road from the Wilberforce house in the High Street of Hull. Yes. William Wilberforce was on the managing committee. I mentioned a committee called the London Immigration Committee, which was the vehicle to assist all these women to migrate to Australia. Wilberforce was on the managing committee of the philanthropic organisation, the charitable organisation, which was the parent body of the London Immigration Committee. So he was certainly aware of it, certainly working, you know, to provide opportunities for people. Another name associated with Wilberforce is Thomas Clarkson. John Marshall, when he first went to London, was took rooms in a building that Clarkson also was involved in. So there are lots of connections, yes. And it's a matter of joining those dots. But you're right. I've also looked into Marshall's association with slavery, and especially because of Featherstone, because they traded with Jamaica, and one of the boys died on his way home, or men, he was 34, died on the way home from Jamaica. I haven't found any evidence of dealing in slavery at all, and I suspect the Hull evangelical Wilberforce connection with Marshall precluded that. However, when Marshall first went to London, to Hackney, he rented a house from the Bond Estates. Now, the Bond Estates was Bond was a slaver in Jamaica, but I think that's a little bit tenuous, and Marshall wasn't there for all that long, and I think it may have been an opportunity, just as a vacant premise, that he could live upstairs and run his business from downstairs. And then he moved to one of those fabulous houses, 5 houses, in Hackney as his fortunes improved. So there are sort of a couple of, but I think any person in Britain in that time, any person of business, you could sort of find a few vague connections to slavery, yes. Perhaps, but I haven't found any hard evidence. That's not to say it doesn't exist, it's just that I haven't found any if it does.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, John, I just muted your mic. I thought you had finished. I just muted your microphone. My apologies. Please do.
If there's nobody else wanted to ask a question, I just wanted to ask Liz, what would the sort of typical time be for these voyages to Australia have taken with the emigrants on board, and how often en route would they have had to take on more stores?
Certainly the women's ships, the 14 ships that John Marshall organised from London, went directly Gravesend to the port of arrival. The voyages took between 96 and 120 days, so 3-4 months. Not the 6 months, 8 months that the first fleet took. The very early ships limped along, but these were A1 ships. They were good ships,
yes.
for the time. So they one factor actually that sort of relates to what you asked, and also what Stefan asked before about religion. Going back to that, there's another very strong connection, Melbourne and Hull, through Frances Perry, who's the wife of our first Anglican bishop, who was her family were evangelical. She was baptised at Fish Street Independent Chapel, which no longer exists, and their family was from Allenby, and her father's name was Cooper, and he was also involved in the shipbuilding industry. And her husband, Bishop Charles Perry, and Frances Perry were in Melbourne at the time of our first governor, who was Charles Joseph La Trobe. And Charles Joseph La Trobe was a Moravian, and he was educated at Fullbeck College. So, you know, there's quite a lot of connections between Hull, Yorkshire and Melbourne in those very early years. And really no one's made anything of those connections, but they're very strong and also influential in Melbourne life.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I promise not to cut you off again. Any further questions? We've got time for one more, I think. Nope. Well, in that case, it falls to me to do the last one, which is one thing. This may not be apparent from the sources list, so this might be an entirely unfair question, but I was struck by his network of agents across the southwest of England. On one level, you can see why. I mean, it's a relatively poor part of the country, but on another, it's not the most populous part of the country either, and therefore perhaps not going to generate the greatest volume of business. Is there any indication of why he concentrated on the southwest peninsula?
I don't know that it was a concentration down there. I think that there are agents all around the country, and it's just that I happened to pick those because I found good access to them. But there may be more down there, on the other hand, because of his immigration depot, and so he's wanting to fill the depot. And it took a lot of time and expense for people wanting to emigrate to go from the southwest of England up to London, you know, where most ships used to depart at Gravesend. And so and also for ships battling their way through the Channel, it often took 2 weeks for ships to go from Gravesend to Plymouth because of the adverse winds. So it was much more convenient for people from the southwest to board at Plymouth. But also there was a downturn in mining, I'm pretty sure, in the 1840s down in Cornwall. And so that's why when Marshall got that contract to send people to for the copper in South Australia, South Australia was full of cordage. In fact, some of my forebears did exactly that, went from Cornwall to South Australia and for the copper.
Yeah, that all makes complete sense. Okay, so I think we'll draw proceedings to a close for this evening. Just on a practical note, obviously this is the final seminar of the 2021-22 programme, and for another year we've not been back in Blaydes House. This has been for a variety of reasons. Obviously this evening it would not have been very practical for to be from Blaydes House, but we did hope to for a previous one. We really do hope that will be the case back in the autumn, and obviously we will be publicising the seminar series through the usual channels when we get the 2022-2023 programme together. And with that, it just remains for me to say 3 thank yous. The first thank you to Liz, especially for getting up so early in the morning, but also for a fascinating paper. So that's really brought the series to an excellent conclusion. And thank you very much indeed, Liz. The second, as always, is to Claire behind the scenes for managing all of this rather complicated program so ably. So thank you very much to you, Claire. And the final thank you, of course, is to everybody who's attended. You know, that's why we put these events on. So thank you, one and all, and a very good night to you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. Bye all.
And a very good day to you, Liz.
Thank you.
Thank you.